Amish kitchens have no electricity, no digital thermometers, and no stand mixers. And somehow, the pies that come out of those kitchens put most modern bakeries to shame. That is not luck. That is the result of tricks passed down through generations of women who learned to bake before they learned to read. Number 19 on this list uses a technique so delicate you can read a newspaper through the finished dough. And the method behind number 8 is something most home bakers today get completely wrong, even with a recipe sitting right in front of them. These are not secret recipes. They are the hands-on moves that turned simple flour, lard, and sugar into something people still talk about decades later. Here are 25 brilliant Amish baking tricks every senior should learn now. Number 25, adding a splash of white vinegar to pie dough. This is one of the oldest Amish pie tricks still in use today. You add about a teaspoon of plain white vinegar to your ice water before mixing it into the flour. The acid keeps the gluten from tightening up, which means the crust stays tender and flaky instead of turning tough and chewy. Most commercial pie dough relies on chemical additives to get the same result. Amish women figured it out with a bottle that cost almost nothing and sat on every pantry shelf in Lancaster County. The vinegar bakes off completely. You will never taste it, but you will feel the difference the second you press your fork through that crust. It shatters instead of bending. Number 24, grating frozen lard into flour for biscuits. Most people cut cold butter into flour with a pastry cutter or 2 knives. Amish bakers skip all of that. They take a block of lard, freeze it solid, and then grate it on a box grater straight into the flour bowl. The tiny shreds of frozen fat distribute perfectly without any overworking. When those biscuits hit the oven, every little flake of lard melts and leaves behind a pocket of air. That is where the layers come from. No folding, no laminating, no fancy technique. Just a frozen block and a grater your grandmother already owned. The biscuits come out so tall they split clean across the middle without a knife. Before I go further, for the folks who want all of these baking tricks and more gathered in one place, I put together the Vintage Recipe Guide. It is a collection of the best recipes and methods I have covered on this channel, and you can find it on my website, vintagelifestyleusa.com. I am not going to mention it again. If you want it, it is there. Now, back to the list. Number 23, saving potato water for bread dough. Every time an Amish household boiled potatoes for supper, the cooking water went into a jar on the counter, not down the drain. That starchy liquid replaced plain water in bread recipes. The starch feeds the yeast and holds moisture inside the crumb, so the loaf stays soft for days longer than it would otherwise. You do not need a special ingredient. You just need to stop throwing away what you already cooked. A loaf made with potato water has a slight chewiness and a silky crumb that plain water bread never achieves. Some bakers added a spoonful of the mashed potato itself, which made the bread even softer and gave it a faint golden color without any added fat. Number 22, proofing dough near a warm stove instead of guessing the temperature. Modern recipes tell you to proof bread dough at a specific number on a thermostat. Amish bakers never had one. They set the dough bowl on a chair near the wood stove, covered it with a damp cloth, and checked it by eye. The trick is distance. Too close and the yeast moves too fast and the bread tastes sour. Too far and nothing happens for hours. They learned to read the dough itself, the way it domed, the way it sprang back slowly when you poked it with a finger. A fast snapback meant it needed more time. A slow, gentle return meant it was ready. No gadget replaces that kind of attention. Number 21, baking a pie inside a brown paper bag. This sounds like a mistake, but it is one of the most reliable tricks in Amish pie baking. You slide the whole pie, dish and all, into a large brown paper grocery bag, fold the end shut, and place it in the oven. The bag traps steam around the pie, which cooks the fruit filling evenly while the crust stays pale and tender instead of burning at the edges. When the time is up, you tear the bag open and let the crust brown for the last few minutes uncovered. No foil tent, no pie shield, no burned edges you have to cut away. Just a paper bag and patience. Apple pie bakers in Holmes County, Ohio swore by this method for generations. Walk through an Amish kitchen and you will not find a single cookbook on the shelf. Not because they are against the written word, because baking was taught hand to hand, mother to daughter, standing side by side at the same counter. The measurements were a cupped palm of flour, a pinch that meant exactly as much as your fingers could hold, a pour of buttermilk that stopped when the dough looked right. None of that translates to a printed page. A recipe card can tell you a quarter cup. It cannot tell you how the dough should feel between your thumb and forefinger when it is ready. That knowledge lived in muscle memory, passed along in kitchens where the only textbook was the last batch that came out of the oven. Today, people spend hundreds of dollars on baking courses that teach what those women already knew by the age of 12. The difference is that nobody sold it to them. They just learned it because supper depended on it. Number 20. Using buttermilk as a natural leavener. Amish bakers paired buttermilk with baking soda long before commercial baking powder existed in every grocery store. The acid in the buttermilk reacts with the soda and creates gas bubbles that lift the batter from the inside. Pancakes, cornbread, quick biscuits, all of them rose without a single packet of commercial yeast. The buttermilk also adds a faint tang that balances sweet batters and gives the crumb a tenderness that plain milk never delivers. You can still do this today with a carton from any dairy aisle. 1 cup of buttermilk and half a teaspoon of baking soda replaces most store-bought leavening blends, and the flavor is not even close to the same. The buttermilk version wins every time. Number 19. Stretching strudel dough by hand until you can read through it. This is the trick that separates Amish strudel from every shortcut version you have ever tasted. The dough itself is simple. Flour, a little oil, warm water, and a pinch of salt. You knead it until it is smooth, and then you let it rest under a warm bowl for about 30 minutes. That rest period lets the gluten relax completely. Then comes the part that takes real skill. You flour a clean tablecloth, set the dough in the center, and start pulling it outward with the backs of your hands, not your fingertips. Your fingertips will poke holes. The backs of your hands stretch it evenly. You walk around the table, pulling gently from every side, rotating, stretching, until the dough is so thin you can see the pattern of the cloth underneath. Some Amish women say you should be able to read a newspaper through it. That is not an exaggeration. The dough becomes almost translucent, like a sheet of tissue paper that holds together by sheer stubbornness. When you roll it around a filling of sliced apples, cinnamon, breadcrumbs, and butter, each layer bakes into something so light it shatters when you bite into it. No store-bought phyllo comes close. Phyllo is machine-rolled and dried. This is alive. It holds warmth and butter in a way that only hand-pulled dough can, because every layer is slightly uneven, slightly thicker in one spot, and thinner in another, and that variation is what gives it character. Factory dough is uniform. Amish strudel dough is human. You can taste the difference with your eyes closed, and once you have pulled your own sheet of dough across a kitchen table and watched the light come through it, you will never buy the boxed version again. Number 18. Replacing eggs with applesauce in quick breads. Eggs were not always plentiful on an Amish farm, especially in late winter when the hens slowed down and the coop went quiet. Amish bakers learned that a quarter cup of unsweetened applesauce could stand in for 1 egg in muffins, banana bread, and spice cakes. The pectin in the applesauce binds the batter the same way egg protein does, and it adds moisture without making things heavy. The bread comes out slightly denser but stays soft for days longer than an egg-based version. The texture is closer to a pound cake than a sponge, and for spiced breads and pumpkin loaves, that heavier crumb is exactly what you want. You would never guess the eggs were missing unless somebody told you. It was born from scarcity, and it turned out to be a better recipe. Number 17. Soaking oats overnight before folding them into bread dough. Raw oats dropped straight into bread dough steal moisture from everything around them. The loaf comes out dry and crumbly by the second day. Amish bakers soaked their oats in warm water or milk the night before baking. By morning, the oats had swelled and softened, and they went into the dough already saturated. The finished bread held its moisture far longer than plain white loaves and had a heavier, more satisfying chew that held up under a thick layer of butter. Some families added a spoonful of honey to the soaking liquid, which gave the oats a faint sweetness that carried through the whole crumb. The bread sliced clean even on day 4, and it toasted beautifully on a cast iron griddle the morning after. Number 16. Wetting your hands before shaping sticky dough. This sounds almost too simple to count as a trick, but it changes everything when you try it. Amish bakers wet their hands under the faucet before touching any sticky dough, whether it was cinnamon rolls, dinner rolls, or soft pretzels. The thin film of water kept the dough from sticking to their palms without adding extra flour, which would have toughened the surface and changed the texture of the finished product. You get a smoother shape and a softer crust. Modern bakers reach for cooking spray or parchment paper. A splash of cold water does the same job and costs nothing. Sometimes the simplest trick is the one nobody thinks to try, and this one has been saving Amish bakers from sticky messes for longer than anyone can remember. Number 15. Swapping molasses for refined white sugar in baked goods. In many Amish communities, white sugar was a luxury that had to be bought in town. Molasses was cheaper, lasted longer on the pantry shelf, and brought a depth of flavor that plain sugar could never match. Amish bakers used it in gingerbread, chouflée pie, oatmeal cookies, and dark pumpernickel loaves. Molasses also holds moisture, which means baked goods made with it stay soft longer than those made with granulated sugar. 1 tablespoon in a cookie recipe turns a flat, dry wafer into something that bends before it breaks. The flavor is darker, richer, and more complex. White sugar sweetens, molasses transforms, and it gives your kitchen a smell that takes most people straight back to their grandmother's house on a cold November morning. There was no timer on the wall, no beep from an oven. Amish bakers learned to judge doneness by smell, by color, and by the sound the oven made when the bread was ready. A loaf that was done thumped hollow. A pie crust that needed more time still looked pale at the fluted edge. Cookies were pulled when the center barely lost its shine. All of this happened without a single digital readout. The modern kitchen treats baking like engineering. Precise temperatures, exact gram measurements, timed to the second. The Amish kitchen treated it like a conversation between the baker and the dough. One approach produces consistency. The other produces bread that tastes like somebody made it with their hands, because somebody did. Both methods work, but only one of them teaches you to actually bake. The other teaches you to follow instructions. There is a difference, and anyone who has tasted both knows exactly what it is. Number 14. Catching wild yeast to build a sourdough starter from nothing. Before you could buy a packet of active dry yeast at the grocery store, Amish bakers made their own. The process was remarkably simple and required only flour and water. You mixed equal parts into a jar, left it loosely covered on the counter, and waited. Within a few days, wild yeast from the air and from the grain itself colonized the mixture. It started to bubble. It started to smell tangy and alive. You fed it more flour and water every day. And within a week or so, you had a living starter that could raise bread for the rest of your life, as long as you kept feeding it. Some Amish families kept the same starter going for decades, passing it from one generation to the next, the way other families pass down a cast iron skillet or a quilt pattern. The bread it produced had a flavor that commercial yeast cannot replicate. That deep, slightly sour tang, that chewy crust, that open crumb with irregular holes, all of it came from organisms that lived in the flour and the kitchen air. Every starter was different because every kitchen had its own population of microbes. A starter from a farmhouse in Ohio tasted different from one in a Pennsylvania kitchen, even using the same recipe. That is not folklore. That is biology. And it cost nothing but patience. No trip to the store, no expiration date, just flour, water, time, and the invisible life already floating in the room where the bread was baked. That starter was alive, and it made everything it touched taste like home. You cannot buy that in a store, and you never could. Number 13. Cooling angel food cake upside down the moment it leaves the oven. If you have ever pulled an angel food cake from the oven and watched it collapse into a sad, dense disc within 10 minutes, you skipped this step. Amish bakers flipped the pan upside down immediately and let it cool completely while hanging inverted. Most tube pans have little feet on the rim for exactly this purpose. Some women balance the pan over a glass bottle if the feet were missing. Gravity pulls the delicate crumb downward while it sets, which prevents the cake from compressing under its own steam and weight. The result is a tall, airy cake that holds its shape all the way to the table. Skip this one step, and the whole thing deflates before you can cut a slice. Number 12. Stirring sour cream into cake batter for moisture that lasts. Amish cooks discovered that a few generous spoonfuls of sour cream in a chocolate cake or a spice cake kept the crumb moist for days longer than butter alone could manage. The fat in the sour cream coats the flour proteins and slows down the staling process. The acidity also tenderizes the gluten, so the cake feels softer on your tongue. A simple yellow cake with sour cream in the batter still tastes fresh on day 3, when a cake without it has already gone dry and crumbly by the second afternoon. 2 spoonfuls of sour cream and the whole cake changes. Amish women used it in everything from birthday cakes to coffee cakes, and once you try it, plain butter cake tastes like cardboard. Number 11. Greasing baking pans with a thin coat of lard and a dusting of flour. Cooking spray did not exist in an Amish kitchen, and butter burned too easily at the high temperatures needed for bread and heavy cakes. Lard had a higher smoke point and created a slick, even coating that released baked goods cleanly every time. You rubbed a thin layer across the inside of the pan with your fingers, then tossed in a handful of flour and tapped it around until every surface was evenly covered. The bread slid out in one piece. The cake came out whole. No stuck corners, no torn bottoms, no prying with a knife. A 10-second step that saved every single bake from the frustration of a stuck cake or a loaf that came out in pieces. Number 10. Thumping the bottom of a loaf to check if the bread is done. No thermometer, no timer. You pulled the loaf from the oven, flipped it over in a towel, and knocked on the bottom with your knuckles. A hollow sound meant the bread was finished. A dull thud meant it needed more time. Amish bakers trusted that sound more than any number on a dial, and they were almost never wrong. It works because a fully baked loaf has lost enough internal moisture that the crumb has set into a firm structure, and firm structures resonate when you knock on them. Underbaked bread is still wet inside and absorbs the knock instead of echoing it back. Once you learn that hollow ring, you never forget it. Walk down the baking aisle of any supermarket today and count the boxes: cake mix, brownie mix, muffin mix, biscuit mix, pie crust in a box, frosting in a can. Every single one of those products replaced a skill, not a recipe. A skill. The ability to feel when dough is ready. The instinct to pull a pan from the oven 30 seconds before the timer says to. The knowledge that a cold kitchen makes better pastry than a warm one. Those are things you learn with your hands, not from a label. The baking industry did not just sell convenience. It sold the idea that baking is hard and that you need their help to do it right. Amish women never bought that story. They kept baking the way their mothers taught them, and the proof sat on the table every single evening. Golden, warm, and made from memory. Number 9. Using honey as a natural moisture keeper in bread and cakes. Honey is hygroscopic, which means it pulls moisture from the air and holds it inside whatever you bake with it. Amish bakers added a tablespoon or 2 of raw honey to bread dough, cookie batter, and even some pie fillings. The result was baked goods that stayed soft and pliable days after coming out of the oven, long after a batch made with white sugar would have turned stale. A loaf of honey wheat bread made on Monday still sliced clean and soft on Thursday. White sugar dries out, honey holds on. That one difference changed how long a single baking day could feed an entire family, and it is still the easiest upgrade you can make to any homemade loaf. Number 8. Cutting steam vents the right way in a double crust pie. Most people know you are supposed to cut slits in the top crust of a pie. What most people get wrong is how they do it. A few lazy knife pokes in the center is not enough. Amish bakers cut deliberate, evenly spaced vents in a pattern that allowed steam to escape from every part of the filling, not just the middle. Some used a fork to prick a ring of tiny holes around the outer edge where the 2 crusts met and sealed. Others cut a small round hole in the dead center and surrounded it with angled slashes radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. The point was airflow. A pie with poor venting traps steam under the top crust, and that trapped steam turns the bottom of the upper crust soggy. You end up with a beautiful golden top and a layer of wet, gummy paste underneath that nobody wants to eat. Proper venting lets the moisture escape gradually, so the filling thickens to the right consistency and the crust stays crisp on both sides, top and bottom. Amish bakers also knew that the vents served a second purpose that had nothing to do with texture. They let you see the filling bubble. When juice started to push up through the slits and the edges of those openings began to darken and caramelize, the pie was done. No guessing. No cutting into it early to check. The pie told you it was ready, but only if you gave it the right openings to speak through. Every Amish baker who ever pulled a perfect double-crust pie from the oven knew that the vents were not decoration. They were the difference between a soggy mess and a pie worth remembering. Number 7. Kneading bread with the heel of your hand instead of your fingers. Amish women kneaded bread dough with a specific motion that most home bakers have never been taught. Push forward with the heel of the palm, fold the dough back over itself, give it a quarter turn, and push again. The heel delivers broad, even pressure across the whole mass of dough without poking or tearing. Fingertip kneading creates uneven texture and often overworks small sections while leaving other parts underdeveloped. The heel method builds gluten uniformly, which means the bread rises evenly and holds a tall shape in the oven. 10 minutes of steady heel kneading replaced any stand mixer, and it cost nothing but a sore wrist and a dusting of flour on your apron. Number 6. Resting dough overnight in a cold pantry for a slow rise. Amish bakers often mixed their bread dough in the evening, covered the bowl with a cloth, and set it on a pantry shelf well away from the stove. The cold slowed the yeast down to a crawl, and the dough rose slowly over 8 to 10 hours instead of 1 or 2. That slow, patient rise develops more complex flavors than a fast, warm proof ever could. The acids and alcohols produced by the yeast during that long fermentation give the bread a deeper taste, a better crust, and a crumb that pulls apart in soft, uneven sheets. By morning, the dough was ready to shape and bake, and the kitchen already smelled like a bakery before the oven was even lit. Number 5. Stretching flour with ground oats when supplies ran low. Flour was not always easy to come by, especially in remote Amish communities during long winters when the roads were bad and trips to town were rare. Amish bakers ground rolled oats in a hand mill or a mortar and mixed the coarse oat flour with wheat flour to stretch their supply further. A blend of roughly 1 part oat flour to 3 parts wheat flour worked in most bread and muffin recipes without changing the texture too much. The oats added a nutty, warm flavor and extra fiber. It was not a compromise. It was an improvement that happened because somebody ran short and flat out refused to stop baking. Necessity made a better loaf than the original recipe ever did. Number 4. Pulling a piece of dough to a window pane to test if the gluten is ready. After kneading, Amish bakers pinched off a small piece of dough and stretched it gently between their fingers. If it pulled into a thin, almost translucent sheet without tearing, the gluten was developed enough and the kneading was done. If the dough ripped before it got thin, they went back to the counter and kneaded for another few minutes before testing again. This simple check told them more about the readiness of the dough than any recipe timer could. A properly developed window pane means the bread will hold gas bubbles evenly during the rise and bake into a tall, well-structured loaf with a crumb that pulls apart in long, soft strands instead of crumbling. Number 3. Scalding milk before mixing it into bread dough. Fresh milk straight from the cow contains whey proteins that can interfere with gluten development and weaken the rise. Amish bakers heated their milk in a small pot just until tiny bubbles formed around the edge, then pulled it off and let it cool to lukewarm before adding it to the flour. That brief scalding deactivates the problematic proteins and changes the structure of the milk sugars in a way that helps the crust brown more evenly in the oven. The bread comes out taller, with a softer crumb and a richer color. Skipping this step is the single biggest reason so many milk-based breads turn out flat, pale, and dense. Amish bakers never skipped it because they learned from watching what happened when someone did. Number 2. Brushing raw crust with heavy cream before it goes into the oven. Amish bakers did not use egg wash the way French pastry kitchens do. They brushed the top of an unbaked pie crust or bread loaf with a thin layer of heavy cream instead. The milk fat in the cream browns slowly in the oven heat and gives the surface a deep, even golden color without the glossy, shellacked look that egg wash produces. The finish is matte, warm, and natural. It also adds a faint richness to the crust that you can taste in the very first bite. 1 spoonful of cream, applied with a pastry brush, or even the back of a spoon, and the whole pie looks like it belongs in a farmhouse painting. Number 1. Baking by feel instead of by recipe. This is the trick that holds every other trick on this list together. Amish bakers did not measure flour in level cups. They scooped with their hand and knew the weight by feel. They did not set a timer. They watched the color of the crust and listened to the sound of the oven. They did not follow steps printed on a card. They followed the dough. Every adjustment happened in real time, based on the humidity in the kitchen, the age of the flour, the temperature of the room, and the mood of the yeast that morning. That kind of baking cannot be written down in a recipe book because it lives in the hands. And the only way to learn it is to stand at the counter, make a mess, burn a batch, and try again the next day. Every Amish baker who ever turned out a perfect loaf of bread learned it exactly that way. Not from a book, not from a screen, from the dough itself. Number 23. Amish Haystack Supper. This was the original build-your-own meal long before any fast food chain thought of it. You lined up bowls down the center of the table. One had cooked rice, one had seasoned ground beef. Then came shredded lettuce, diced tomatoes, chopped onions, crushed crackers, and cheese sauce made from a block of Velveeta melted with a little milk. Everyone built their own stack on a plate, layering whatever they wanted in whatever order they wanted. Kids loved it because they got to choose. Parents loved it because it stretched a pound of ground beef across a table of 8. Church suppers in Holmes County, Ohio, served this to 100 people at a time. The ingredients came to pennies per plate. Number 20. Cutting flour with potato starch. When flour was expensive or hard to get, you boiled potatoes, mashed them smooth, and mixed the starchy paste right into your bread dough. The potato kept the bread moist longer, gave it a softer crumb, and stretched your flour supply by 1/3. You could do the same thing with biscuits and rolls. Amish bakers knew that a loaf made with potato held up for days without going stale, while a loaf made with flour alone started drying out by the second morning. It was not a compromise. The bread was better. Some Amish bakers added mashed potato to every loaf they made, not because they had to, but because the result was worth the extra step. Number 22. Cold milk soup. This one sounds strange if you have never had it. You took a bowl, broke day-old bread into pieces, poured cold milk over it, and added whatever fruit was ripe. Blueberries, strawberries, sliced peaches, no cooking at all. On the hottest days of summer, when lighting the stove felt like punishment, this was what went on the table. Children loved it because it tasted like dessert, and the parents loved it because it used up stale bread and cost nothing. Some families added a pinch of sugar or a drizzle of molasses. Others did not bother. The fruit was sweet enough on its own. You could eat it standing at the counter or sitting under the shade tree in the yard. Either way, it took less than 2 minutes to put together, and it kept you going until the evening cooled off enough to light the stove again. Number 16. Amish onion patties. These were thick slices of onion dipped in a simple batter of flour, cornmeal, sugar, and salt, then fried in hot oil until crispy. Some families served them as a side, but in plenty of Amish homes, these were the main event on a summer evening alongside a bowl of soup or a plate of sliced tomatoes from the garden. The sweetness of the onion came through the salty crunch of the batter, and there was nothing else quite like it. One batch used 2 onions and a half cup of flour. Cost was almost nothing. They came out of the skillet so hot you had to wait a full minute before biting in. There is a difference between being poor and cooking poor. The Amish were not always poor. Many of them owned land, kept livestock, and ran profitable farms. But they cooked as if every ingredient mattered because to them it did. Wasting food was not just impractical, it was disrespectful. A potato that went soft got grated into patties. Stale bread became filling. Bruised apples turned into sauce or dried slices for winter stew. This was not desperation. This was discipline. And it produced meals that tasted better than most of what lines grocery store shelves today. Because when you know the cost of everything on your plate, you season it like it matters. You cook it like you mean it. You sit down and you eat it like it is worth your time. Number 22, drying herbs in sealing bundles. You cut your sage, thyme, rosemary, and dill right before the flowers opened, when the oils were strongest. You tied them in small bunches with kitchen twine and hung them upside down from a nail in the pantry ceiling or from the rafters of a covered porch. Warm air rose and dried them slowly over a week or two. Once they crumbled between your fingers, you stripped the leaves and stored them in small jars. No dehydrator, no oven, no electricity at all. Just air and gravity. Those dried herbs kept their flavor for a full year if you stored them out of the light. One summer afternoon of cutting and tying gave you a full winter of seasoning without spending a cent. Number 24, haystack supper. This was not a casserole and it was not a salad. It was a build-your-own plate, and everybody at the table got exactly what they wanted. You started with a base of crushed saltine crackers or rice, then layered on seasoned ground beef, shredded lettuce, diced tomatoes, chopped onion, and whatever cheese the family had on hand. Everyone made their own stack, which meant the cook only had to prepare the ingredients and set them out in bowls, not plate anything. Church groups and large family gatherings loved this because it handled a crowd without any fuss and without any complaints. The ground beef stretched with oats or breadcrumbs, and the vegetables came straight from the garden. Children ate it because they got to choose what went on top, and the adults ate it because there was nothing to argue about. Number 22, chicken corn soup. Take a whole chicken, boil it until the meat falls off the bone, and strip every shred into the broth. Add fresh corn cut straight from the cob, diced hard-boiled eggs, and a handful of homemade noodles, salt, pepper, a touch of parsley. That is it. This soup was a summer staple in Pennsylvania Dutch country when the corn was high and the chickens were plentiful. A whole yard bird cost less than $1 in the 1950s, and the corn came straight from the field, so the entire pot ran you well under $2. One bird and a dozen ears of corn fed a family for 2 days. The hard-boiled eggs made it hearty enough that nobody asked what else was for dinner. Church groups in Lancaster still serve it at fundraiser suppers today because it feeds a crowd and nobody ever complains about the taste. Number 16, saving bacon drippings as everyday cooking fat. Every time you fried bacon, you poured the hot grease through a small strainer into a jar that sat on the back of the stove. That jar never emptied because you added to it every week. You used that fat to fry eggs, season cast iron, grease a baking pan, start a pot of beans, or sear a pork chop. It added a smoky richness to everything it touched. Amish kitchens did not have bottles of olive oil or spray cans of cooking lubricant. They had a jar of bacon grease, and it did the job better than anything you could buy. That jar was never empty and never clean, and everything that came out of the skillet tasted like it had been loved. There was a time when a family could feed itself from what it grew, raised, preserved, and stored. Then the grocery store showed up and made everything faster. Canned goods replaced home canning. Vegetable oil replaced lard. Store-bought yeast replaced sourdough starters that had been alive for years. Nobody forced anyone to stop. It just got easier to buy than to make. And one by one, the skills disappeared. Not because they stopped working, but because people stopped needing them. The irony is that most of what the Amish were doing in the 1950s is exactly what people today are paying good money to relearn. Fermenting, curing, preserving, stretching ingredients. The techniques never became obsolete. We just forgot we knew them. Number 21, tomato pie. By August, the tomato plants were producing faster than anyone could eat them, and this pie was one way to keep up. You lined a pie crust with thick slices of ripe tomato, layered on fresh basil if you had it, then topped the whole thing with a mixture of mayonnaise and shredded cheese. Into the oven until the top browned and the tomatoes softened into something halfway between a sauce and a filling. It sounds simple because it was. The crust was homemade, rolled out on a floured board the same way it had been done for generations. One pie used 4 or 5 tomatoes and fed the whole family for supper with a side of bread. No meat required. The tomatoes carried all the flavor, and in a good summer, those tomatoes tasted like nothing you could buy in a store. Most Amish homes had 2 kitchens, the main one inside the house and a second one outside or in a separate building used only in the warm months. They called it the summer kitchen. The idea was simple. Canning season meant the stove ran all day, and running a wood-fired stove indoors in July turned the house into an oven itself. So the cooking moved outside, where the heat could escape and the women could work without soaking through their dresses by noon. Some summer kitchens were just a roof over a stove and a table. Others were full rooms with shelves lined with jars. The meals that came out of those kitchens were shaped by the season because you cooked what you grew and you grew what the weather allowed. Nothing came from a freezer. Nothing came from a box. Number 19. Umaseti. The name sounds made up, but it has been a staple in Amish and Mennonite homes for generations. You start by browning ground beef with diced onion. In a separate pot, you cook a batch of egg noodles. Then you layer them in a casserole dish. Beef on the bottom, noodles on top, and a sauce made from tomato soup, cream of mushroom soup, and a splash of milk poured over everything. A thick layer of cheese goes on last. It bakes until the cheese bubbles and the edges turn golden brown. This was the dish that showed up at every funeral, every barn raising, and every church potluck in northern Indiana and central Ohio. It traveled well, it reheated well, and it fed 12 people from a single baking dish. The women who carried it through the door never announced it. They just set it on the table and went to find the coffee. What made Umaseti work was its honesty. There was nothing fancy about it. No herb garnish, no complicated technique. It was ground beef and noodles and soup from a can. But when you ate it after a day of raising a neighbor's barn by hand, or after sitting through a 3-hour funeral service on a hard wooden bench, it tasted like exactly what you needed. The warmth of it, the weight of it, the way it sat in your stomach and told you the day was over and you had done your part. Some families added a layer of peas. Some used cream of chicken instead of mushroom. The Amish do not write down recipes the way the rest of us do. They pass them mouth to mouth, hand to hand, and every kitchen adjusts. But the bones of Umaseti never change. Meat, noodles, sauce, cheese, $1 and change for a pan that fed the whole family. That was the math that mattered. Number 19. Preserving eggs for months without refrigeration. You took fresh eggs, still unwashed so the natural bloom stayed on the shell, and you rubbed each one with a thin coat of mineral oil. That oil sealed the tiny pores in the shell and kept air and bacteria from getting inside. Then you set the eggs point down in a cool, dark place. A cellar shelf worked fine. Those eggs stayed fresh for 3 months, sometimes longer. The key was that you never wash the egg before coating it. A freshly laid egg has an invisible protective layer called the bloom that seals the shell naturally. Washing removes it. The mineral oil replaced what washing would take away, and it did it better because oil does not evaporate. Some families used a different method. They mixed a bucket of water glass, which is a liquid sodium silicate, and submerged the eggs completely. The water glass formed a hard, airtight seal around each shell. Eggs stored this way lasted 6 months or more and came out looking and tasting like they had been laid that week. You cracked one open in February and the yolk stood up tall and bright orange, the same as the day the hen laid it. Either way, the trick was the same. Keep air out and keep the egg cold. Amish families with a flock of laying hens put up dozens of eggs every spring when production was high and pulled from that supply all winter when the hens slowed down. A family with 20 hens could preserve enough eggs in March and April to last until the flock started laying again the following spring. You never bought eggs from a store. You did not need to. The pantry had them, sealed and waiting, row after row in wooden crates that smelled faintly of mineral oil and straw. Number 19. Peanut butter church spread on bread. If you have ever been to an Amish church lunch, you have seen this. After every Sunday service, the congregation ate together, and this spread was on the table without exception. It was 3 ingredients: peanut butter, marshmallow creme, and corn syrup mixed together until it turned into something smooth and sweet that spread easily on fresh bread. That was lunch. That and pickled beets, red beet eggs, bread, and maybe a slice of cheese. The simplicity was the point. Nobody was trying to impress anyone. The meal was about being together, not about the food, and this spread was the centerpiece because it cost almost nothing, it traveled well, and children would eat it without complaint. Every family made it slightly differently. Some used more corn syrup for sweetness. Others kept it thick and let the peanut butter do the talking. But the basic formula stayed the same across communities in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and everywhere else the Amish settled. The marshmallow creme was the only store-bought ingredient that might raise an eyebrow, but even the most traditional cooks used it because the alternative was boiling sugar into a syrup, and nobody had time for that on a Saturday night before church. You could make a batch for a few dollars that would last through multiple Sundays. The jars sat in the pantry next to the canned peaches and the pickled beets, always ready. Spread it on homemade white bread, and that was a meal that held you until supper. Nobody left a church lunch hungry, and nobody left without tasting this spread. No plates needed, no forks, no fuss. Just bread, spread, and a long table full of people who had known each other their whole lives. Number 25, Rivel Soup. This is flour, an egg, a pinch of salt, and a pot of milk. You mix the flour and egg between your fingers until it crumbles into little pea-sized lumps. Those lumps go straight into simmering milk. 5 minutes and supper is on the table. Amish mothers made this on nights when the garden was bare and the cellar was running low. Some families added a little butter at the end. Some sprinkled brown sugar on top and called it dessert, but most ate it plain from a deep bowl with a spoon and a piece of bread on the side. The whole pot cost less than the price of a candy bar. It was the kind of meal that tasted like someone cared enough to stand at the stove when there was almost nothing left to cook with. Number 23, making vinegar from apple scraps. You saved the cores and peels from every apple you used, dropped them into a wide-mouthed jar, covered them with water and a spoonful of sugar, and tied a cloth over the top. Then you waited. After about 2 weeks, the liquid started to smell sharp and sour. After a month, it was vinegar. Real, usable apple cider vinegar made from scraps that most people threw in the compost pile. Amish women kept a vinegar jar going on the counter year-round, feeding it fresh scraps whenever they had them. That vinegar went into pickles, salad dressings, cleaning solutions, and home remedies. Some women kept 2 jars going at once, one for cooking and one for cleaning. You poured off what you needed and topped it up with fresh scraps and water. The jar never ran dry, and you never had to buy a bottle. Number 25, chicken corn soup. Every Amish kitchen in Pennsylvania had a version of this by the end of July. You started with a whole chicken, boiled it until the meat fell off the bone, then pulled it apart by hand. Fresh corn got cut right off the cob and dropped into that broth along with celery, onion, and a handful of rivels, which are tiny pinches of egg dough rolled between your fingers. No thickener, no cream, just the starch from the corn and the dough doing the work. A pot of this fed a table of 10 on ingredients that came from the yard and the hen house. The broth turned golden from the fat, and on a hot August evening, that soup went down easier than anything else you could put on the table. Number 17, cabbage and noodle skillet. You shredded half a head of cabbage, fried it in butter with a sliced onion until it was soft and sweet, and tossed it with cooked egg noodles. Salt, pepper, nothing more. The whole dish came together in 20 minutes and used ingredients that every Amish pantry had year-round. Cabbage kept all winter in the root cellar. Flour and eggs for noodles were always on hand. Some families added a little vinegar at the end for sharpness. Some tossed in bits of leftover ham if they had it, but the plain version needed nothing else. The butter and the long, slow cooking turned the cabbage into something almost sweet. A whole skillet for the family cost less than 60 cents. Number 21, Open kettle canning for tomatoes. You brought a big pot of tomatoes to a rolling boil, ladled them straight into sterilized jars, and sealed the lids while everything was still hot. The heat created the vacuum. No water bath, no pressure canner, just the boiling temperature of the food itself. Amish cooks did this with tomatoes, applesauce, and fruit preserves. The acidity of the tomatoes made it safe, and a pinch of salt and a squeeze of lemon juice kept the color bright. A single row of tomato jars in the cellar could carry a family through 6 months of winter soups, stews, and casseroles. You heard that seal pop when you opened one in December, and the kitchen smelled like August. Amish women timed the harvest so they could put up a full year's worth of tomatoes in a single week, working from dawn until the last jar sealed. People today call it meal prep. The Amish called it survival. Every shelf in that pantry was organized by season. The front row held what you needed this week. The back row held what would get you through February. Nothing was random. The jars were filled in order, dated with a grease pencil, and rotated so the oldest got used first. The root cellar below kept potatoes, carrots, turnips, and onions buried in damp sand at a steady temperature all winter long. The smokehouse out back held the meat. The springhouse kept the dairy cold. It was a network, and every part of it depended on the others. When one piece failed, you felt it in your meals for months. That is why these tricks mattered. They were not clever ideas. They were the difference between eating well in January and going hungry. Number 20, creamed new potatoes and peas. The first potatoes of the season were small, barely bigger than a golf ball, and they came out of the ground sometime in June. You boiled them whole, skins still on, and while they cooked you shelled fresh peas from the garden. Both went into a white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk. That was the whole recipe: salt, pepper, and whatever the garden gave you that morning. This was a side dish in some homes and the entire meal in others, depending on how many mouths needed feeding and how much milk was in the icebox. The sauce stretched everything. A dozen small potatoes and a bowl of peas became enough food for a family when you wrapped it in something creamy and warm. Number 20, scrapple. This was pork scraps, cornmeal, flour, and spices cooked into a mush, poured into a loaf pan, and chilled until solid. The next morning, you sliced it thick and fried it in a cast iron skillet until both sides were dark and crispy. Inside, it stayed soft. Outside, it crackled. Scrapple was born from butchering day. After the good cuts were salted and smoked, the leftover bits went into the scrapple pot. Nothing was wasted. You ate it with eggs for breakfast, but plenty of Amish families served it for supper with fried potatoes and applesauce on the side. In Philadelphia and across the Delaware Valley, diners still sell it today. The cost was nearly zero because the ingredients were what nobody else wanted. Number 18, keeping a sourdough starter as your only leavening. You mixed flour and water in a jar, left it on the counter, and waited for the wild yeast in the air to find it. After a few days, it started bubbling. You fed it more flour and water every day, and within a week, you had a living starter that could raise bread, pancakes, biscuits, and even cake. No store-bought yeast, no baking powder, just a jar of flour paste that you kept alive the way you kept a fire going. Some Amish families had starters that had been passed down for decades. You gave a cup of it to a new bride as a wedding gift. That jar of starter was worth more than a set of dishes because it meant she could bake from the day she moved into her own kitchen. Number 23, green bean and ham pot. You picked the beans that morning. That was the rule. If they sat around for a day, they lost their snap, and no Amish cook wanted a limp green bean on the table. The beans went into a heavy pot with a leftover ham bone, a few small potatoes cut in half, and enough water to cover everything. It simmered for hours, low and slow, until the beans were soft and the broth tasted like smoke and salt. No seasoning beyond black pepper. The ham did all the work. Families planted rows and rows of green beans because they produced all summer long, and this one pot turned a free vegetable and a leftover bone into a meal that nobody walked away from hungry. Number 24, Schnitz und Knepp. This is dried apple slices simmered with a ham hock and topped with dumplings. The name is Pennsylvania Dutch, and it sounds like something out of a storybook. But it was real weeknight food across Lancaster, Lebanon, and Berks counties for 200 years. You soaked the dried apples overnight. The next day, you dropped them into a pot with whatever ham bone you had, covered it with water, and let it go low and slow for a couple of hours. A ham hock cost about 15 cents at the butcher in the 1940s, and most families dried their own apples from the trees out back, so the whole pot came together for well under $1. Then you mixed up a simple biscuit dough, tore off pieces, and dropped them right on top of the bubbling pot. The lid went on and you did not touch it for 15 minutes. The dumplings steamed through, the apples turned soft and sweet, and the ham gave everything salt. Sweet and savory in one bowl, and nobody called it fusion cooking. It was just supper. Number 24. Rendering lard from leaf fat. You took the white fat from around the kidneys of a hog, cut it into small cubes, and put it in a heavy pot over the lowest heat you could manage. You stirred it every few minutes and watched it melt down into a clear golden liquid. The little bits of tissue that did not melt turned into cracklings, and you lifted those out with a slotted spoon. What was left in the pot was pure lard. You poured it through cheesecloth into mason jars, and once it cooled, it turned white as snow. That lard made the flakiest pie crust you ever tasted, fried potatoes better than any oil on a store shelf, and lasted for months in a cool pantry without going rancid. One hog gave you enough cooking fat to last a family until spring. Number 15. Amish poor man's steak. Take a pound of ground beef, mix it with crushed saltine crackers, a diced onion, and an egg, then press it flat into a baking dish. Cut it into rectangles, coat each one in flour, and brown them in a skillet. Lay them back in the dish, pour a can of cream of mushroom soup thinned with a little water over the top, and bake it until everything is bubbling. Ground beef ran about 25 cents a pound through most of the 1950s, and a box of saltines was a dime. The whole dish came out to roughly 50 cents for a family of 6. This was steak night for families who could not afford a real steak. The crackers stretched the meat. The soup made the gravy. And when you pulled those rectangles out of the oven, browned on top with thick mushroom sauce underneath, nobody at the table felt like they were settling. You served it with mashed potatoes or buttered bread to soak up the gravy. Number 17. Wrapping cheese in vinegar-soaked cloth. You tore a piece of muslin or clean cotton, dipped it in plain white vinegar, wrung it out, and wrapped it tight around a block of hard cheese. Then you stored the cheese in the cellar, or the coolest corner of the pantry. The vinegar kept mold from forming on the surface. When the cloth dried out, you soaked it again. A wheel of cheddar wrapped this way lasted for months without a single spot of mold. No plastic wrap, no wax coating, just a damp cloth and vinegar. The cheese aged slowly in the cool air and actually tasted better after a few weeks than it did on the day you wrapped it. You could keep rewrapping with fresh vinegar cloth as often as you needed, and the cheese just kept improving. Number 18. Amish bread filling. Take a loaf of day-old bread, tear it into chunks, and toss it in a bowl with sautéed celery, onions, and butter. Add a couple of beaten eggs and enough chicken broth to make it moist but not soggy. Season it with sage and salt. Pack it into a baking dish and let it go in the oven until the top turns golden and the inside stays soft. This was Thanksgiving in Amish country, except they did not wait for November. Bread filling showed up on a Tuesday just as easily. It used stale bread that would have gone to waste otherwise and turned it into the centerpiece of supper. Number 14. Shaking cream into butter in a glass jar. You poured fresh heavy cream into a quart mason jar, screwed the lid on tight, and started shaking. For the first 5 minutes, nothing happened. The cream just sloshed around. Then it thickened into whipped cream and you thought you were done. But you were not. You kept shaking, and right when your arms started to burn, something shifted. The fat separated from the liquid with a sudden thump, and you had a lump of golden butter sitting in a pool of pale buttermilk. You drained the buttermilk into a separate jar because that had its own uses in biscuits, pancakes, and salad dressings. Then you rinsed the butter under cold running water, working it with a wooden spoon or a pair of paddles, folding and pressing until the water ran clear. That rinsing step was the part most people skipped, and it was the part that mattered most. Buttermilk left inside the butter turned rancid within days. Properly rinsed butter lasted for weeks in a cool cellar. You pressed it into a wooden mold carved with a wheat sheaf or a flour, wrapped it in wax paper, and set it in the springhouse to firm up. The whole process took about 15 minutes and cost nothing beyond the cream. Amish children learned this before they could read. A 10-year-old standing on a stool, shaking a jar with both hands, was earning her place at the table. The buttermilk was never wasted. It went into cornbread, into soup, into anything that needed a little tang and a tender crumb. One jar of cream gave you 2 products, and both of them were better than anything wrapped in foil at the grocery store. Number 17. Hamburger casserole. Ground beef was one of the cheaper meats available, and Amish cooks stretched it further than anyone. This casserole layered browned ground beef with sliced raw potatoes and onion in a deep baking dish, then poured home-canned tomatoes over the top. Into the oven for about an hour until the potatoes were tender and the edges got crispy. The tomatoes broke down into a sauce that soaked into the potatoes from the top, while the beef dripping soaked in from below. Some families added a layer of cheese on top in the last few minutes. Others kept it plain. 1 pound of ground beef, 5 potatoes, and an onion fed a family of 6 with leftovers. You could double the recipe if company was coming, and the whole thing still cost almost nothing to put together. Number 14. Amish succotash. Corn and lima beans. That is the heart of it. You cooked them together in a pot with a knob of butter, a little salt, and sometimes a splash of cream. That was the whole recipe. But in Amish communities across Pennsylvania and Ohio, succotash was more than a side dish. It was the answer to the question of what to do with the last of the summer harvest before the frost came. The women picked the final ears of corn from the garden, cut the kernels off the cob, shelled the last of the lima beans, and put them in a pot together. It was a closing ceremony for the growing season. You ate what the land gave you, right up to the end. Some families added diced tomatoes. A few put in a little bacon for salt, but the purest version was just corn, beans, and butter, and it was enough. The sweetness of late-season corn against the starchy weight of the limas made a combination that needed nothing else. It filled a plate by itself, and with a piece of bread beside it, that was supper. What made succotash special was not the taste. It was the timing. This was a meal you ate knowing that tomorrow the garden would be finished. The jars were sealed, the root cellar was stocked, and the table shifted from fresh food to preserved food until spring. Succotash was the last fresh meal of the year, and every family at the table knew it. You did not rush through it. 40 cents for a pot that fed 6, and every spoonful tasted like the sun was leaving. Number 13. Thickening soup with stale bread. When a pot of soup was too thin, you tore a few slices of day-old bread into pieces and dropped them straight into the broth. They dissolved within minutes and thickened the liquid into something that coated the back of a spoon. No cornstarch, no flour slurry, no roux. Just bread that was too hard to eat on its own, finding a second life in the soup pot. Amish cooks called this stretching the meal, because it made a watery broth feel like a full dinner. You served it in a bowl with more bread on the side, and nobody left the table hungry. It was one of those tricks that turned poverty into something warm, and it cost almost nothing. Number 18. Chow chow with cold sliced ham. Chow chow is a pickled vegetable relish, and every Amish family had their own version. The base was usually green tomatoes, cabbage, onion, and whatever else needed using up before it went bad. Peppers, cauliflower, lima beans, corn. All of it chopped, brined, and sealed in jars. In the summer, you opened a jar of last year's chow chow and served it alongside cold sliced ham on a plate with bread. That was supper on the nights when it was too hot to cook and nobody felt like standing over a stove. The sweet and sour bite of the relish cut through the saltiness of the ham, and the bread soaked up everything left on the plate. Number 13. Corn pie. This was fresh corn kernels baked in a deep dish pie shell with beaten eggs, milk, butter, salt, and a dusting of pepper. Some families added a top crust. Others left it open-faced so the top turned golden in the oven. It was not sweet like corn pudding. It was savory, rich, and heavy enough to stand on its own as supper with nothing beside it but a glass of cold milk. Amish women in the Kishokokias Valley in central Pennsylvania were known for their corn pie, and each family swore their version was the right one. The arguments were friendly, but they were real. A whole pie used 4 ears of corn from the garden, 2 eggs at about 3 cents each, and a cup of milk. When the corn was growing in your own yard and the chickens were laying out back, the whole thing cost you next to nothing. Number 15. Raw packing vegetables straight into jars. Instead of blanching or cooking vegetables before canning them, you pack them into jars raw. Green beans, carrots, beets, corn cut straight off the cob. You filled the jar tight, poured boiling water or brine over the top, left a ½ inch of headspace, and sealed it. The pressure canner did the rest. Raw-packed vegetables held their texture better than cooked ones because they only got heated once inside the jar. Amish cooks preferred this method for anything they wanted to stay crisp. You opened a jar of raw packed green beans in winter, and they still had a snap to them that blanched beans never could. It saved time on canning day too, because you skipped the blanching step entirely. Every single one of those tricks came from a kitchen where the oven had no digital display and the measuring cups were hands. Pick one this week. Start with the vinegar in your pie dough, or the overnight rest in a cold pantry, or just thump the bottom of your next loaf and listen for the hollow ring. If you try any of these, leave a comment and tell me which one changed the way you bake. And if you want more of this kind of cooking knowledge, hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Until then, keep the oven warm.